Mr. Chair, I would like to move a motion at this time, and the motion has been given to the clerk in both official languages, and I will read it into the record now.
Sorry, just give me 1 second, please. Sorry, I'm just making sure the clerk has it. He's going to send it out, but please go ahead. Sorry.
That the committee report to the House that it calls on Indigenous services to recover funds given to non-Indigenous companies who took advantage of the Indigenous set-aside.
Great. I'll give everyone 30 seconds just to receive the email, and we'll start a speaking list. Mr. Kuzmierczak and then Mr. Sousa.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. Again, since we just received this this motion, would you mind just allowing us a quick 2-minute recess?
Certainly.
Or, just suspension.
Yeah, if we can keep it to 2 minutes, please.
Thank you.
To this as well, or did you just want to ask for the suspension? Otherwise, we'll go to Mr. Sousa.
Happy to yield the floor to Mr. Sousa and come back around.
Go ahead, Mr. Sousa, then Ms. Atwin.
So we do have an amendment to the motion, and I now yield to Ms. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin, you could have just gone to...
Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead, Mrs. Atwin.
Well, so it's my understanding that this is beyond the authority that Indigenous Services Canada has. And so we would like to amend the motion to read as follows, that the committee calls on Indigenous Services to recommend that funds be recovered if given to non-Indigenous companies who took advantage of the Indigenous set-aside.
And removing report to the House.
That's in the first sentence. So it would remove the reporting to the House component, and it would add that it's a recommendation from Indigenous Services Canada.
Just repeat it, but a bit slower so we can type it in.
Sure. So that the committee calls on Indigenous Services to recommend that funds be recovered if given to non-Indigenous companies who took advantage of the Indigenous set-aside.
Great. So, Mr. Boulouris, on the amendment.
Mr. Chair, through you, I'd like to have a justification for the amendment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it's not within their authority, and so a recommendation it's clearly within. They've already mentioned that it's a possible outcome should that have already been an issue identified, and so it's again keeping it within the scope and authority of Indigenous Services Canada.
Are you able to translate that? No. Continue speaking on? No. Mrs. Goodrich, on the amendment.
Yes, thank you on the amendment. I fail to understand why they wouldn't want the committee to report to the House. I think that it's important. And so I would like a justification as to why that part was removed as well.
Because then it can be a concurrence debate in the House, and we really want to make sure that we're studying this in OGO and we're continuing to have our questions answered. And I think it's an important piece that we do seek that, you know, if there's fraudulent activity in regards to the Indigenous Business Directory, that we get to the bottom of that. However, it has to be within the proper authority of each department. We know that it's within the contracting departments specifically who can oversee some of that work, and so I think it's more appropriate to have that recommendation and to not have it reported to the House.
I have yourself, Mrs. Goodrich, and then I have Mrs. Block on the amendment.
Well, I just think it's interesting that the justification given was simply that they just don't want this to be talked about in any other capacity. I think that's quite shocking, and Canadians would be probably very disappointed to find out that they're so nervous about how bad Indigenous procurement has been. They're terrified of it being discussed in the chamber. So I'll just leave it at that, and I would urge colleagues to vote against this amendment.
Great. I have Mrs. Block, then Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would certainly support the intervention of my colleague, Ms. Goodrich. We understand that groups like the AFN and other rights holders have been raising concerns in regards to the funding of non-First Nations-led groups to develop to receive this funding, and if their concerns are legitimate, and it is found that many non-Indigenous companies have received funding. I think it is incumbent upon us as parliamentarians to bring this to the House to ensure that these funds are put back into that set aside. They are recovered from these non-Indigenous businesses and put back into that set aside for Indigenous businesses in regards to contributing to the economy of Indigenous communities. So I too am shocked to hear them state simply that they don't want to have this discussed in the House of Commons and would encourage all members to vote against this amendment.
Thanks, Mrs. Vignola. Then Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Moi, j'ai plus une question.
I have a question more on the side of, well, really it's a thought or reflection on this. So if funds were awarded to a business, but that the service was provided, the government did receive a service from a purely economic standpoint, there has not been any fraud. The fraud was in an identity being usurped by a business pretending to be someone they weren't. So in that case, I think it would be very difficult to have a good reason to recover those funds. We'd have to look at other punitive measures for that business that assumed an identity that wasn't its own identity. That's really what I'm thinking more. If a service wasn't provided, if a service was provided, but a subcontractor didn't have 33%, that's not the same as if service wasn't provided and the subcontractor didn't meet the 33%. I mean, in that case, I would be perfectly fine with the funds being recovered. But if the service was provided, but it's an identity that was fraudulently appropriated or taken on, in that case, recovering the funds might not be the right method to use. I'm not making an amendment and so on. I'm just trying to add to the discussion, thinking out loud with my colleagues to see whether there'd be a way to rephrase either the amendment or the motion, the original motion, to reflect that perspective that I just talked about. Thank you.
Thanks. I have Mr. Kuzmierczak. Mrs. Block, is your hand up for the speaking list again? Okay, I'll get you to take it down. Mr. Kuzmierczak, go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to reiterate one of the challenges with the way that the original motion is framed is that it puts the onus on Indigenous Services Canada, ISC, to recover those funds. And I think it needs to be highlighted and emphasized that it really is up to each contracting department to recover the funds. And so that's point number one, is that, again, the motion itself is based on a false premise that ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, has the power to recover those funds. It is up to each contracting department or agency to do that. So I think that's important to distinguish that. So the premise of the motion, I have concerns or issues or really questions about. The second point is that I support the amendment that my colleague brought forward. I do believe that this is something that we can handle as a committee, and I believe that the recommendation reflects, or the motion reflects, the fact that it is this committee that is concerned with the funds to be recovered. So we think that that's important. But I also want to put this debate and conversation into a bit of a context here as well, too, especially for folks that might just be tuning in to this conversation. The Treasury Board, I think it was in 2022, amended the mandatory procedures for contracts awarded to Indigenous businesses. And it committed the government to award 5% of the total aggregate of federal contracts to Indigenous businesses each and every year. So the target that was set in 2022 was 5%. And if you look at this, if you look at the report that was provided by Indigenous Services Canada on that mandatory minimum 5% threshold, you'll find that there was actually 6.2% of all contracts were awarded to Indigenous businesses, 6.27%, and that represents $1.6 billion that went directly, of all contracts that went directly to Indigenous businesses. This is tremendous progress. There is more work to be done, no doubt, but it is incredible progress, remarkable when you think about it. And 68 organizations, which represents about 72%. More, 3/4 of departments and organizations, federal departments and organizations, exceeded that target, which is quite remarkable. And you look at, for example, Shared Services Canada, some of the strongest departments like Shared Services Canada, which awarded the highest percentage to Indigenous businesses, which amounted to 19.3% of their contracts, valued at $476.3 million. This is a very big step forward in terms of Indigenous procurement. And so I think it's important to focus on, yes, we want to make sure that the Indigenous procurement, that it is as efficient and effective as possible. We absolutely need to focus on audits and making sure that the funds are distributed effectively and efficiently. But this program is a success. It is a success on so many different fronts, and of course, there's more work to do, and we're always looking at improving it. And so again, I just want to reiterate, and listening to the Deputy Minister talk about how important Indigenous procurement is to achieving economic reconciliation, and the two go hand in hand. And as one of the Indigenous-led businesses, Plato, had written to the committee, with an effective Indigenous procurement system in place, the government could make tremendous steps forward toward economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And so I think it's important for us to focus on also on the context of, again, what is a strong and successful Indigenous procurement program. And I think what was alluded to in a line of questioning that was asked on a couple of occasions, and that was really the importance of co-management. This is something that is at the very basis. Co-development, not co-management. Co-development is really foundational for the success of the Indigenous procurement strategy. Is that co-development truly is at the heart of any updates and any changes to Indigenous procurement policies. It very much is driven from the bottom up as opposed to top down. It truly is. It truly is a partnership. And again, just you go back to $1.6 billion in contracts, and so the question, I think that one of the questions I think that was raised as well too that bears repeating is, it was pointed out that there's about 2,900 companies on the Indigenous Business Directory, and there are upwards of 60,000 Indigenous businesses across Canada. And so the question is, how do we make sure that we eliminate barriers to federal procurement contracts to Indigenous businesses, so that we can get that number up even higher. So with that, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to provide a little bit of a context of this motion, frame it in the context of a successful Indigenous procurement program that we are all looking forward as partners to improve and expand and to grow. But again, early results are in. It is a very successful program that has yielded tremendous benefits and tremendous results. And so with that, I will yield the floor, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Boulris, on the amendment.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's more of a technicality. I understand the English version, but in the French version, things are a little bit confusing. Actually, there's a few words missing that should be added to make it more readable.
Yes, I've heard that from the clerk as well, that the French version, whoever did it, I apologize for saying this, but apparently it's not very correct. So the...
It's not readable.
Yeah, I've heard not readable as well. I've asked the clerk if he could make the adjustments and send out. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment?
Me?
Mr. Jouari, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And then-
with 1 minute, I know.
Sorry. As soon as everyone gets or as soon as we're done, we'll send the email out. So keep an eye for that. Thank you, Mr. Boulris, for bringing that up. Go ahead.
Oh, I'd like to make 3 points. Number one, as all our colleagues on our side, and I believe some of the opposition has said, this is not within the jurisdiction of ISC. They don't have the mandate, or they do not have the capability to be able to dictate to anyone to be able to return the money. So recommendation is one thing. As part of an audit that they've done, I'm sure they've made that recommendation, number one. Number two, I agree with Julie. If the services were rendered and the end client has signed off on it, it becomes a matter of whether those services and the contract was received under false pretenses, which goes into a separate rhyme of processes to be able to recover that money. And I want to go back and tell everyone.
We are
just 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
30 seconds maximum.
If you
please.
listen to what Madam Wilson was telling us, there are other entities looking at that. And she paused because she could not elaborate anymore. So by us jumping on this thing and reporting to the House and running another concurrence and blocking the House's agenda, it's not going to serve the purpose. Thank you.
I am going to adjourn. We're out of time. I do, though, think Ms. Wilson was referring solely to Dalian and not the other companies. Yes. But perhaps you can provide that in writing or quickly to us.
Clarify, I don't have a financial authority to recover money and goods and services.
No, can't have you speak on the amendment, but if you wanted to speak about that.
I just wanted to be helpful, so
okay,
I'll step back.
Colleagues, I'm sorry, we are out of time. We do not have any resources past now. Thank you, everyone, for your patience for today.